New York, 1991. The streets whispered with fear, and in the heart of the Gambino crime family, loyalty was about to break. Sammy, the bull Gravano, wasn't a man of words, he was a man of silence. But in a courtroom packed with cameras and jurors, that silence ended. And when it did, it shattered the empire of John Gotti, the untouchable Teflon Don. Tonight, drift with us into the story of betrayal, survival, and the quiet confession that changed the American mafia forever. New York City, late 1940s. The war was over, soldiers had come home, and neighborhoods buzzed with life again. In Brooklyn's Bensonhurst, the streets belonged not to Wall Street bankers or polished politicians, but to families, Italian families who carried the old world on their shoulders while making their lives in the new. On those streets walked a boy named Salvatore Gravano. He was quiet, watchful, not the kind of child who sought attention. But he had eyes that studied, measured, and remembered. He would later be called Sammy, and eventually, the Bull. But before the nicknames, before the headlines, he was just another kid in a working-class immigrant neighborhood, learning what it meant to survive. Childhood in Bensonhurst. Bensonhurst in the mid-20th century was a tight weave of culture and struggle. Families cooked on small stoves, neighbors shouted across stoops, and children learned the codes of the street faster than arithmetic in school. Respect wasn't taught in classrooms, it was taught by how you carried yourself when you walked past a group of older boys leaning on the corner. Sammy was small for his age, often underestimated. That didn't last long. He fought when he had to, and word spread fast that he didn't back down. Someone once said he had the heart of a bull, that he'd charge rather than retreat, and the nickname stuck, first as a taunt, then as a badge. His family tried to steer him straight. His father ran a modest business, worked hard, and wanted his son to take the same honest path. But Bensonhurst was not built on honest paths. It was built on deals made in whispers, favors exchanged in shadows, and loyalties tested in silence. First encounters with the life. The Italian-American kids of Bensonhurst all knew about the life. Men in sharp suits who drove better cars than their fathers, who never seemed rushed, who carried themselves with quiet authority. They weren't movie stars, but in the neighborhood they were something bigger, living proof that power could be reached even if you started with nothing. Sammy gravitated toward them. He wasn't dazzled by the cars or the money. It was something subtler, the respect. The way people lowered their voices when these men walked by. The way arguments stopped, shoulders straightened, hats tipped. For a boy who had fought to be taken seriously, respect was a language he understood immediately. By his teenage years, Sammy had found his way into small crews. Nothing heavy, just petty thefts, scuffles, favors. But each step pulled him closer to the orbit of organized crime. He learned how silence could be power, how observation mattered more than words, and how loyalty, even among street kids, could be the difference between walking home or being carried there. The bull emerges. Sammy's toughness wasn't theatrical. He didn't brag, didn't boast. He fought when he had to, won more often than not, and shrugged it off. But the neighborhood noticed. Older guys noticed. One story told years later captured the essence. Sammy, still a teenager, was jumped by a group of older boys. Outnumbered, he fought until he couldn't stand. Bloodied, bruised, but still swinging. When it was over, someone muttered again, "He's like a bull, keeps coming." That was the day the nickname stopped being a joke and started becoming a prophecy. The Army years. In 1964, Salvatore Sammy Gravano took a path not uncommon for young men of his generation. He joined the U.S. Army. America was tightening its grip on conflicts abroad, and for a kid from Bensonhurst, the Army offered structure, discipline, and a way out of the neighborhood, even if only for a while. Sammy became a paratrooper. The training was brutal. Endless drills, sleepless nights, jumps from planes that tested nerve and muscle alike. But Sammy thrived. His quiet determination, the same resolve that had earned him the nickname the Bull, carried him through. In the Army he learned precision, order, and the kind of discipline that would later make him invaluable in another world. He also learned how to mask fear, because jumping into the sky left no room for hesitation. Those who served with him remembered a man who didn't talk much but acted decisively. A man who wasn't flashy, but when he said something it carried weight. It was a reputation that would follow him back to Brooklyn. Return to Bensonhurst. When Sammy came home, Bensonhurst was both the same and changed. The streets still echoed with kids' shouts, neighbors still gossiped on stoops, and men in suits still commanded silent respect. But Sammy wasn't the same boy who had left. He was harder now, sharper, more disciplined. He tried to live straight at first. He worked construction, considered following the path his father wanted. But the old pull of the neighborhood was too strong. The life, the underworld of organized crime, wasn't just about money. It was about belonging, about respect, about power in a world that rarely offered it to kids from immigrant families. First steps into organized crime. Sammy started small with burglary and hijacking jobs. He joined a crew under the Colombo family, running rackets, shaking down businesses, collecting debts. His army discipline set him apart. While others were reckless, Sammy was methodical. He planned, he observed, and he acted with precision. That precision caught attention. Captains and soldiers noticed that Gravano wasn't loud, wasn't sloppy, and wasn't careless. In a world where mistakes meant prison or death, those qualities were rare and valuable. A reputation for loyalty. Sammy's loyalty became legend in Bensonhurst. He followed orders without question, never hesitated, never spoke out of turn. In a subculture that prized silence and obedience, he was the ideal soldier. Stories circulated about his willingness to stand firm under pressure, to fight when needed, to hold his ground when others wavered. The bull didn't just fight physically anymore, he fought with loyalty, with silence, with a steadiness that made him indispensable. Shifting allegiances. By the 1970s, tensions in the Colombo family pushed Sammy toward new alliances. He gravitated toward the Gambino family, where his skills and loyalty found greater opportunity. The Gambinos were the most powerful of the 5 families, and under their umbrella, Sammy's rise would accelerate. It was here, among the Gambinos, that Gravano's quiet presence began to carry weight. He wasn't the face of the organization. That role belonged to flashier men. But he was the backbone, the man others leaned on, the one who executed plans without fanfare. The underboss in the making. Step by step, Sammy moved higher. First as a soldier, then as a capo, running crews, collecting tributes, managing rackets. His construction background proved invaluable. He understood contracts, unions, and the kinds of deals that made money flow steadily and silently. By the time John Gotti rose to power in the mid-1980s, Gravano was already positioned as a trusted figure. Their partnership would soon define an era of the Gambino family, one flamboyant and loud, the other quiet and calculating. Together they seemed unstoppable. But even in these early years, a seed of contradiction lived inside Gravano. He was fiercely loyal, bound by omertà, shaped by discipline and respect. And yet, as the years unfolded, it would be that same discipline, that same quiet calculation, that led him to break the very code he once embodied. The 1980s, a new order. New York in the 1980s was a city of contrast. Glittering skyscrapers rose above crumbling neighborhoods. Wall Street pulsed with money while crime surged in the boroughs. And beneath it all, the 5 families of the American mafia maneuvered like hidden governments, each family vying for power, money, and survival. For the Gambino family, the 1980s began with turmoil. Paul Castellano, the reigning boss, favored quiet profits over street-level violence. He leaned toward business deals, labor racketeering, and legitimacy. To some, this was smart. Avoid headlines, avoid heat. To others, it was weakness. Among those others, was John Gotti, the Dapper Don. John Gotti was everything Paul Castellano wasn't. Loud, flamboyant, dressed in expensive suits with silk ties. He relished the cameras, smiled for reporters, and courted the nickname, the Dapper Don. While Castellano hid from the public, Gotti performed for it. Gravano was not cut from the same cloth. He had no taste for flash, no desire for cameras. Yet when their paths crossed, the 2 men found a strange complement. Gotti was the face. Gravano was the spine. The assassination of Castellano. December 16, 1985. Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. Castellano and his underboss were gunned down in one of the most infamous mob hits in American history. The message was clear. Gotti had seized power. And by his side, ensuring discipline and stability, stood Sammy, the bull Gravano. For Gravano, the moment was a crossroads. Aligning with Gotti was not just survival, it was opportunity. Gotti needed someone steady, loyal, and disciplined to balance his flamboyance. Gravano was that man. The rise to underboss. By 1986, Gravano had been elevated to underboss of the Gambino family, the second highest position in the most powerful mafia organization in America. The role was not symbolic. As underboss, Gravano managed day-to-day operations, overseeing captains and crews, handling disputes quietly, ensuring money flowed upward, steadily and without interruption, acting as the buffer between soldiers and the boss. Where Gotti drew attention, Gravano maintained order. Where Gotti smiled for cameras, Gravano calculated in silence. a partnership of opposites. In many ways, Gotti and Gravano were a paradox. Gotti thrived on visibility, enjoying the notoriety that most mob bosses avoided. Gravano thrived on invisibility, finding strength in being underestimated. Together they balanced each other, for a time. But under the glitter of Gotti's public image, Gravano saw the risks. Cameras brought heat. Headlines drew prosecutors. And the FBI was listening closer than ever. The underboss in shadows. Through the late 1980s, Gravano perfected his role as the quiet underboss. He ran construction rackets, managed union deals, and ensured money flowed through Gambino channels. His background in construction gave him an edge. He understood contracts, kickbacks, and the subtle art of making millions without drawing attention. While Gotti soaked up the spotlight, Gravano kept the machinery running. Associates knew that behind the silk ties and the sound bites, the real work, the discipline, the organization, flowed through the bull. He didn't boast. He didn't brag. He didn't need to. The silence was his strength, and in that silence, his power grew. By the dawn of the 1990s, Sammy Gravano had become one of the most powerful underbosses in mafia history. Yet the very qualities that made him indispensable, his loyalty, his discipline, his silence, would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. Because in a world ruled by loyalty, one whisper could undo an empire. And Gravano, the man who had built his life on omertà, was approaching the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Omertà, the unspoken law. In the world of organized crime there was one rule above all others. Omertà. It was more than silence. It was a covenant, a sacred bond that defined what it meant to live la cosa nostra, our thing. To break omertà was to erase yourself. It was betrayal not only of men but of an entire way of life. The mafia could tolerate greed, mistakes, even violence, but never betrayal. Words spoken to outsiders were words of death. For generations, omertà had been the glue holding together the five families of New York. When the government pressed, when prosecutors begged for testimony, when the world outside demanded answers, the men inside simply stared back in silence. It wasn't just a rule. It was identity. It was survival. Sammy the loyal soldier. Sammy Gravano embodied omertà in his early years. He wasn't flashy, didn't draw attention, didn't talk more than necessary. To him, silence wasn't a burden, it was natural. In Bensonhurst, silence had been how he survived as a boy. In the army, silence had been how he earned respect. And in the mafia, silence became how he built loyalty. When bosses asked him to handle disputes, he handled them without discussion. When envelopes passed through his hands, he never revealed names. When violence was ordered, he didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't excuse. He carried out his role quietly, faithfully. Associates knew, Sammy never talked. And because he never talked, men trusted him. The enforcement of silence. Omertà wasn't just about keeping your own mouth shut, it was about ensuring others kept theirs shut too. There were times when Sammy was tasked with making examples. A soldier suspected of speaking too freely. A bookmaker who might have whispered to police. A union official tempted to share details. The punishments were swift, sometimes final. Sammy didn't relish them, but he understood their necessity. If silence broke, everything broke. Fear kept men loyal, but omertà kept them alive. One story told of a man suspected of talking out of turn at a bar, drunk and careless. The next day he was gone. No explanation. No funeral. Only whispers left behind, whispering not about what he had said, but about what omertà demanded. The culture of loyalty. Within the Gambino family, omertà was reinforced in every interaction. Soldiers avoided direct names, using gestures and nicknames instead. Conversations stopped when outsiders entered the room. Phones were never trusted. Even among friends there were limits to what could be said. Loyalty wasn't proven by words, it was proven by silence. And Sammy Gravano was its model student. Gotti and Gravano, a contrast. John Gotti, the flamboyant boss, thrived on breaking some rules of tradition. He loved the spotlight, the cameras, the headlines. Gravano, by contrast, was the embodiment of restraint. Where Gotti smiled for reporters, Gravano kept his mouth closed. Where Gotti's words sometimes attracted attention, Gravano's silence deflected it. Together they created a balance, one feeding on attention, the other shielding the family from its consequences. But the balance was fragile. And the louder Gotti became, the more Gravano's silence was tested. First test with the law. By the early 1970s, Gravano's name occasionally crossed police desks. He wasn't yet a major player, but he was in the orbit of men who were. Inevitably, that meant encounters with detectives, summonses to precinct houses, and the occasional interrogation in dimly lit rooms. The police tried the usual tactics: small talk, subtle pressure, promises of leniency. They wanted names, dates, hints of who was behind certain burglaries or hijackings. Sammy gave them nothing. Not anger, not denial, just nothing. He sat, stone-faced, answering only what was legally unavoidable. His silence wasn't bravado, it was instinct. He understood that a single misplaced word could ripple outward, endangering not only himself but everyone he touched. The detectives grew frustrated. One described him later as a kid who looked like he'd already been trained for this. In truth, he had been. Bensonhurst itself had been his training ground, teaching him that silence was the only safe answer. The lesson of the drunk soldier. One night in the mid-70s, Gravano's crew encountered a problem. A soldier, drunk and loose-tongued, had let slip more than he should have at a neighborhood bar. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to make others uneasy. Sammy was tasked with addressing it. The soldier wasn't an enemy, wasn't a traitor, just careless. Gravano pulled him aside, spoke quietly, explained the stakes. "You don't talk," he said. "Not when you're drunk, not when you're tired, not ever. You keep your mouth shut or you put us all in the ground." The soldier sobered up quickly, not from the alcohol, but from the realization of what his loose lips could cost. Gravano didn't need to raise his voice. The quiet weight of his warning was enough. It was a lesson delivered without violence. But everyone understood. If it happened again, omertà would demand finality. Silence as survival. As Gravano's responsibilities grew, so did the weight of omertà. He attended meetings where captains discussed unions, construction contracts, and casino skimming. He saw envelopes passed, disputes settled, punishments decided. And every time, he carried the weight of knowledge that could never be spoken outside the room. Silence wasn't just an obligation, it was armor. Words were vulnerabilities. Information was ammunition. To speak was to expose yourself. Gravano's silence made him valuable. Bosses trusted him with details others weren't given. Crews relied on him to keep secrets buried. And prosecutors, no matter how hard they tried, found him impenetrable. The burden of loyalty. But silence came with a cost. It meant swallowing doubts, hiding emotions, pretending not to notice when friends disappeared. It meant carrying the knowledge of crimes, betrayals, and violence without release. At night, in quiet moments, Gravano felt the burden pressing down. Loyalty demanded it. Omertà required it. And for years he bore it willingly. Yet deep inside, silence was planting another seed, a seed of disillusionment. Because what happens when loyalty isn't returned? What happens when silence protects men who no longer protect you? Those questions would take years to bloom, but even in the 1970s, Gravano knew. Omertà was both his shield and his chain. FBI pressure in the 1980s. By the early 1980s, the FBI had shifted its tactics. No longer content to chase individual crimes, they now pursued entire organizations under RICO statutes. Wiretaps, surveillance vans, undercover informants. The federal net grew tighter around the five families. The Gambino family, especially under John Gotti's rising influence, was a prime target. Social clubs were bugged, payphones monitored, meetings photographed from rooftops. Agents waited outside diners, noting who arrived, who left, how long they stayed. Sammy Gravano, by then a capo and soon to be underboss, was in the thick of it. He knew every word mattered, every glance could be misinterpreted. And so he doubled down on silence. He taught his men to say nothing, to trust no phone, to keep conversations short and vague. The louder Gotti became, the quieter Gravano grew. Gotti's voice, Gravano's silence. John Gotti loved the spotlight. He enjoyed the cameras outside courthouses, the headlines dubbing him the Teflon Don, the image of untouchability. He spoke too freely, joked too openly, reveled in attention that most bosses shunned. Sammy Gravano, standing beside him, was his opposite. Where Gotti smiled for reporters, Gravano stared past them. Where Gotti cracked jokes and bugged social clubs, Gravano answered with nods or silence. Among soldiers the contrast was stark. Gotti drew heat, Gravano deflected it. One was the lightning rod, the other the grounding wire. A reputation of stone. By this point, Gravano's reputation for loyalty and silence had hardened into legend. Prosecutors privately admitted frustration. He doesn't give you anything. Not a look, not a slip, not a single stray word. Within the Gambino family, Sammy was the gold standard of omertà. If others hesitated, he remained steady. If others panicked, he stayed calm. His silence wasn't just obedience, it was survival elevated to art. The cracks beneath. But silence, while outwardly strong, was inwardly corrosive. Gravano saw men fall not because they betrayed the code, but because they were sacrificed under it. He noticed how loyalty was sometimes one-sided, how bosses used omertà as a shield for themselves while discarding others. The code demanded silence, even when silence meant prison, even when silence meant death. For decades, Gravano accepted that. But the seed planted years earlier, the question of whether loyalty was truly reciprocal, remained buried deep. Closing the chapter. In the 1980s, Sammy Gravano was the perfect disciple of omertà. He embodied the law of silence, enforced it, lived it, and in doing so became indispensable to the Gambino family. But even the most perfect silence has limits. The louder Gotti grew, the more fragile omertà became. And for the man who had built his life on never speaking out, the greatest test still lay ahead, the moment when silence itself would betray him. The assassination that changed everything. December 16, 1985. It was cold in Manhattan, Christmas lights strung across avenues, taxis honking through midtown traffic. Inside Sparks Steakhouse, Paul Castellano, the reigning boss of the Gambino family, was expected for dinner. Outside, waiting in the crisp night air, were gunmen hidden in plain sight. When Castellano stepped from his car, the street erupted in gunfire. Shouts, chaos, glass breaking. The boss of the most powerful mafia family in America collapsed on the sidewalk, lifeless, his reign over in seconds. The message was unmistakable. John Gotti had seized the crown. And standing just behind him, steady and silent, was Sammy Gravano. A new kind of Don. The mafia had seen flamboyant bosses before, but none like Gotti. He wore Brioni suits that cost more than most men's cars. He tipped bartenders with $100 bills. He smiled at cameras as if they were old friends. Newspapers dubbed him the Dapper Don and later the Teflon Don, when trial after trial seemed to bounce off him. But Gotti's charisma came with risk. The spotlight that protected him from some dangers also drew others closer. Federal prosecutors, FBI agents, ambitious rivals. For every headline that praised his style, another one whispered about his recklessness. Gravano's role. Sammy Gravano, promoted to underboss, became the stabilizer. Where Gotti craved attention, Gravano avoided it. Where Gotti thrived in conversation, Gravano thrived in silence. He managed the family's operations with military discipline. Construction rackets, union influence, loan sharking, gambling. He understood how to turn power into steady income, how to keep money flowing while avoiding unnecessary attention. To the outside world, Gotti was the star. Inside the Gambino family, Gravano was the quiet engine. Rave Night Social Club. Much of Gotti's era revolved around the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy. To passers-by, it looked like just another neighborhood hangout. Inside, it was the beating heart of the Gambino empire. Reporters staked out the sidewalks, snapping photos of Gotti arriving in tailored coats, flashing rings, shaking hands. And behind him, Gravano appeared, smaller, less flashy, often overlooked by cameras. But inside, when the doors closed, it was Gravano who kept the room in order. He listened when Gotti talked too freely. He interrupted when discussion strayed. He reminded captains of discipline, of rules, of the cost of mistakes. One soldier later said, "Gotti made you feel like you were in a movie. Sammy made sure you lived to see the ending." The balance of opposites. Together they were a paradox. Gotti drew headlines, Gravano deflected heat. Gotti embodied charisma, Gravano embodied calculation. One lived loudly, the other in whispers. It worked, for a time. The family's power grew, money flowed, and the Gambinos dominated the underworld. But the cracks in this partnership were already forming, hidden in the very differences that made it strong. Because in the mafia the spotlight is dangerous. And the louder one man speaks, the harder it becomes for another to remain silent. The construction king. While John Gotti posed for headlines, Sammy Gravano built the invisible skeleton of the Gambino empire. His specialty was construction. In New York, no skyscraper rose, no concrete poured, no contract signed without touching the shadow of organized crime. Gravano knew the unions, the contractors, the foremen. He understood how to squeeze without breaking, how to delay a project until envelopes were filled, how to settle disputes before hammers hit steel. The Gambino family, under Gravano's guidance, turned construction into a quiet gold mine. Developers paid to avoid strikes. Unions bent under subtle pressure. Even legitimate businessmen learned the unspoken rule. If you wanted to build in New York, you paid the price. Sammy didn't need to shout. He didn't need cameras. The power was in the silence of contracts, in the unmarked bills exchanged in darkened rooms. Unions as puppets. Beyond construction sites, unions themselves became extensions of the Gambino family. Leadership positions were filled with loyal men, votes manipulated, strikes orchestrated. To the public these were labor disputes. To Gravano they were levers of power. Truckers stopped when told. Dockworkers stalled shipments. Concrete crews waited for the nod. Each delay cost millions, and each solution brought envelopes to the underboss's table. Gravano managed it like a general, quiet, efficient, decisive. Where Gotti thrived on theatrics, Gravano thrived on results. Gotti the celebrity. Meanwhile, John Gotti was becoming a household name. The media adored him. Cameras flocked to courthouses where he strutted in silk ties and camel hair coats. Tabloids splashed his photos on front pages, dubbing him the Dapper Don for his style, then the Teflon Don, after juries repeatedly acquitted him. For ordinary Americans he was a paradox, a criminal boss who looked like a movie star. Some admired his defiance, others loathed his arrogance, but all watched him. In bars across New York, televisions replayed his trials. Housewives whispered his name. Taxi drivers swapped stories about seeing him in Little Italy. Gotti wasn't just a mobster, he was a cultural icon. Gravano's perspective. For Gravano this was both strength and danger. Gotti's fame protected them in some ways. Prosecutors hated losing, juries sometimes hesitated to convict a man so admired. But fame also drew scrutiny. The FBI bugged the Rave Night Social Club. Agents followed Gotti everywhere. Prosecutors sharpened their knives. The very light that gave Gotti confidence also illuminated every man who walked beside him. Gravano saw the cracks forming. He didn't argue with Gotti, loyalty demanded silence. But in private moments he weighed the risks. A mafia family was supposed to thrive in shadows. Now its boss lived in the spotlight. America watches. By the late 1980s, the Gambino family under Gotti and Gravano was the most famous criminal enterprise in America. Documentaries aired. Journalists published exposés. Even Hollywood paid attention. But beneath the glitz, Gravano kept the machinery running. He wasn't the face on magazine covers. He was the man in the corner, flipping through contracts, keeping soldiers in line, making sure the river of money never stopped flowing. To the world, Gotti was the Don. Inside the life, Gravano was the reason the Don could keep smiling for the cameras. The Rave Night Bug. In 1989, the FBI scored one of its most important victories against the Gambino family. After months of surveillance, agents successfully planted hidden microphones inside the Rave Night Social Club, Gotti's headquarters in Little Italy. 4 years, Rave Night had been the stage where Gotti held court, laughing, telling stories, smoking in his silk suits. The place was alive with chatter, banter, and the kind of bravado Gotti couldn't resist. He thought it was his fortress. Instead it became his trap. Hidden in ceilings and walls, the microphones captured everything. Every laugh, every boast, every whispered grumble. For prosecutors it was gold. For Gotti it was a death sentence waiting to be unwrapped. Gotti's voice. On tape after tape, Gotti could be heard discussing murders, criticizing allies, even venting about Sammy Gravano. His words, meant to assert dominance, now lived forever in FBI transcripts. The Don who had thrived on headlines now found himself undone by his own voice. Gravano's silence. Sammy Gravano, on those same tapes, was often silent. He responded with short words, nods or not at all. The contrast was stark. Where Gotti filled rooms with noise, Gravano filled them with quiet calculation. To FBI agents listening, Gravano was a puzzle. They could hear Gotti incriminate himself, but Sammy? He gave them almost nothing. He was a shadow beside the star, hard to pin down, harder still to predict. The growing divide. Within the family, men noticed the difference too. Some admired Gotti's charisma, his ability to charm even in the face of law enforcement. Others whispered about his recklessness, his hunger for attention that made everyone vulnerable. And in those whispers, Gravano's steadiness shone brighter. Soldiers trusted him. Captains respected him. If Gotti was the face of power, Gravano was the backbone. But in the tapes, something else emerged. Gotti sometimes shifted blame, hinting that Gravano carried responsibility for decisions that brought heat. It was subtle, but to a man as disciplined as Gravano, it was impossible to ignore. The shadow of betrayal. Sammy Gravano had spent his life living omertà, embodying silence, protecting the family. But now, in the very recordings meant to incriminate them all, he heard his loyalty questioned. He didn't react immediately. He remained the quiet underboss, running operations, enforcing discipline, making money flow. But inside, a seed began to sprout, a question that had lingered since his early years. What happens when loyalty is not returned? The Gotti era was at its peak. But in the shadows of its brightest spotlight, the first cracks in loyalty had begun to spread. Pressure from all sides. By 1990, the Gambino family was still the most powerful mafia organization in America, but the ground beneath it was shifting. The FBI had dozens of agents dedicated solely to John Gotti. Surveillance vans camped outside the rave night social club. Prosecutors sifted through thousands of hours of wiretaps. The Teflon Don string of acquittals had only sharpened the government's determination to bring him down. Every captain, every soldier felt the weight. Raids became more frequent. Subpoenas piled up. Business partners grew nervous. The sense of invincibility that had defined the Gotti era was beginning to erode. Gotti's arrogance. John Gotti responded not with caution, but with defiance. He relished the attention, smiling for cameras outside court, shaking hands with neighbors as if he were a celebrity. The tabloids loved him. Nightly news ran segments on his suits, his swagger, his charm. But for men inside the life, the performance was dangerous. Every appearance meant more scrutiny. Every headline meant more investigators. And in the world of organized crime, scrutiny was poison. Gravano saw it clearly. He admired Gotti's charisma but worried about its cost. A mafia family wasn't meant to thrive in the light, it was meant to endure in shadows. The underboss holds the line. While Gotti played the public role, Gravano kept the machinery running. Construction rackets, union deals, extortion networks, all continued to flow through his hands. He held meetings in backrooms, managed disputes quietly, kept soldiers focused. Associates respected him. They knew Gravano wasn't chasing fame. He wanted efficiency, money, order. His silence once again became his strength. But whispers reached him too. Soldiers muttered about Gotti's recklessness. Captains hinted that the boss was drawing too much heat. And some of those whispers carried a dangerous question. Was Gravano the steadier hand? Hearing his name. Then came the tapes. When the FBI bugged the Rave Night Social Club, they captured hours of conversations between Gotti and his men. Gravano's name appeared on those tapes, not always flatteringly. Gotti, in his frustration, sometimes blamed Sammy for operations that drew attention. He hinted Gravano was too aggressive in construction rackets, too visible in certain disputes. It was classic mob politics, shifting blame to protect the boss. But for Gravano, a man who had built his life on loyalty, hearing his name cast in doubt cut deep. The first crack. Sammy didn't show it. Outwardly, he remained the quiet underboss, carrying envelopes, enforcing discipline, standing beside the boss. But inside something shifted. For decades, he had believed in omertà, in loyalty as an unbreakable chain. Now he realized loyalty could be a weapon turned against you. Silence had protected him, but it couldn't protect him from betrayal within his own family. It was just a flicker then, a faint thought at the edge of sleepless nights. But it was the beginning of a transformation, the first crack in a foundation that had seemed unshakable. Trials in the spotlight. The late 1980s rolled into 1990, and once again John Gotti was on trial. It had become almost routine, federal prosecutors unveiling new charges, reporters swarming the courthouse, and Gotti striding past them with his silk tie gleaming under the flashbulbs. America watched. To the public, it was entertainment, another episode of the saga of the Teflon Don. To the FBI, it was frustration. To the Gambino family, it was exhaustion. Each trial meant money for lawyers, uncertainty for soldiers, and risk for everyone connected. Gravano, as underboss, bore the weight of keeping the family's operations stable while their boss performed for cameras. Gotti's words. Then came the transcripts. The FBI began releasing snippets from their secret recordings at the Rave Night Social Club. On those tapes, Gotti could be heard speaking candidly, too candidly. He cursed enemies, criticized allies, and most damningly mentioned Sammy Gravano by name. "He's pushing too hard," Gotti grumbled in one recording. "He's the one stirring heat on construction." It wasn't outright betrayal. But for Gravano the message was clear. If the walls closed in, the boss was preparing a scapegoat. And that scapegoat was him. The weight of suspicion. Gravano had spent his life living omertà, absorbing the weight of silence. He had enforced loyalty, punished betrayal, and built his reputation on absolute discipline. But now, for the first time, silence felt like a trap. His loyalty no longer guaranteed protection. His name was being spoken in the very tapes prosecutors would use against them. and the man he had shielded, the flamboyant Don, was already pointing a quiet finger in his direction. Sleepless nights. In those days, Gravano began to feel the press of paranoia he had once associated only with others. Nights in his Staten Island home were restless. He would sit in the dark, cigarette glowing faintly, replaying Gotti's words in his head. Was this the beginning of the end? Would omertà demand that he accept prison, or worse, for a man who was willing to sacrifice him? The foundation of his world, once built on unshakable loyalty, began to tremble. The Don and the underboss. In public, Gravano remained steady. He stood beside Gotti outside court, stone-faced while cameras flashed. He managed the family's rackets, ensured soldiers were paid, kept meetings orderly. To outsiders nothing had changed. But inside the balance was shifting. Gravano had always been the quiet counterweight to Gotti's noise. Now the counterweight felt like a burden. He was holding up a system that was preparing to crush him. The cracks in the foundation were no longer invisible. Gravano could feel them under his feet. The indictments. By late 1990, the weight of federal indictments was staggering. Prosecutors unveiled a sweeping RICO case against John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and other members of the Gambino family. Charges included murder, racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy. The evidence was built not on whispers, but on hours of wiretaps from the Rave Night Social Club. Juries would not be asked to guess, they would be asked to listen. And what they would hear over and over again was John Gotti talking. But in those conversations, one name kept surfacing: Gravano. The shadow of blame. The tapes painted a picture that prosecutors loved. Gotti the charismatic boss, directing violence and schemes. Gravano the enforcer, the man who carried out the dirty work, the underboss whose hands were not clean. It was convenient for the FBI, and for Gotti too. Because when the time came, there was already a narrative forming that Gravano could be the fall guy. For Sammy, the realization was devastating. He had built his life on loyalty, trusting that silence would protect him. Now silence threatened to bury him alive. Isolation in the ranks. Even within the Gambino family, Gravano felt the distance growing. Soldiers avoided his gaze, uncertain of what the future held. Captains whispered about the indictments, careful not to say too much in case another bug was listening. And Gotti? He remained flamboyant, striding into court in tailored suits, flashing smiles to reporters, brushing off the gravity of the charges as if they were nothing more than a nuisance. To Gravano it felt surreal. The family was collapsing under the weight of evidence, and the boss was still playing to cameras. Sleepless calculations. At home, Gravano's nights stretched long and restless. He replayed conversations in his head, both real and recorded. He thought of his family, his wife, his children, and the years they would lose if he remained silent. For the first time in his life, the code of omertà felt less like honor and more like a cage. It demanded sacrifice. It demanded silence. But what if silence only served men who had already betrayed him? The first betrayal. In those sleepless nights, Gravano began to admit what he had never allowed before. Omertà was not sacred. It was conditional. And if the boss himself bent its rules, by blaming, by exposing, by speaking too freely, why should the underboss die for them? The cracks in the foundation had widened. The structure still stood, but Gravano knew. One more weight, one more betrayal, and the whole edifice of silence would collapse. And when it did, it would not only destroy John Gotti. It would destroy everything Gravano had believed in for a lifetime. December 11, 1990. The night air in Little Italy was sharp, carrying the bite of winter. The Rave Night Social Club glowed faintly on Mulberry Street, its neon sign humming above the door. Inside, John Gotti held court as always, flanked by his underboss Sammy Gravano and consigliere Frank Locasio. They were laughing, trading small talk, sipping coffee. To them it was just another night. To the FBI, it was the culmination of years of surveillance. At exactly 8:30 p.m. the trap was sprung. Unmarked cars screeched to a halt. Agents poured into the street, weapons raised. Shouts echoed, "FBI! Don't move!" Inside the club, the doors burst open. Men in suits and bulletproof vests swarmed in. In an instant, the dapper Don's silk tie and Gravano's steady stare were framed by federal agents holding handcuffs. Cameras in the dark. By the time they were marched outside, the press was already waiting. Flashbulbs exploded against the winter sky. Gotti, ever the performer, smirked at the cameras as though it were all just another show. Gravano did not smile. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the crowd, cold and calculating. To him, this wasn't theater, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The men were loaded into FBI vehicles, sirens cutting through Mulberry Street. For the first time in years, the Gambino boss and his underboss weren't walking freely into rave night. They were headed into custody. The charges. The indictment was massive: racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, gambling, loan sharking. For Gotti, the evidence was devastating: hours of recordings from the rave night bug. For Gravano, the recordings were dangerous in another way. His name was woven through them, not as the talker, but as the doer. Prosecutors painted him as Gotti's enforcer, the man who carried out violence while Gotti gave the orders. Gravano knew that even silence could be twisted into guilt. First nights in custody. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan was a far cry from rave night. Concrete walls, metal doors, fluorescent lights that buzzed all night. For Gravano, the adjustment was brutal. In rave night, silence had been a choice, a display of power. In MCC, silence was forced, imposed by guards and the suffocating weight of confinement. The cells were small, the food bland, the days monotonous. Time was measured in counts, in clanging doors, in the shuffle of prisoners through corridors that smelled of sweat and disinfectant. The boss and the underboss behind bars. Inside, the dynamic shifted. Gotti remained flamboyant even in custody. He cracked jokes with guards, strutted through corridors as if the prison were another social club. He carried himself with the same bravado he had shown outside court. Gravano was different. He stayed quiet, watchful, adapting to the rhythms of confinement. He studied other inmates, listened to guards, measured every word. But in the silence of nights, he began to feel the weight pressing heavier. It wasn't just prison walls closing in. It was the realization that loyalty might not be enough this time. The interrogation rooms. The first week inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center brought the inevitable interrogations. Federal agents escorted Gravano from his cell to small, windowless rooms with buzzing fluorescent lights. They weren't rough. They didn't need to be. Instead, they used patience. Coffee placed on the table. Papers stacked neatly in files. A tape recorder that clicked on and hummed. The questions came slowly, softly, circling around him like vultures. Names. Dates. Union disputes. Construction rackets. Who gave the orders? Who pulled the triggers? Sammy said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on the wall. Silence wasn't just habit, it was his creed. For every question there was no answer. For every push no give. The agents exchanged glances, frustrated but not surprised. Gravano's reputation was well known. He was a stone wall, one agent muttered later. Gotti's performance. In contrast, John Gotti reveled even in custody. To guards, to lawyers, even to fellow inmates, he played the part of the untouchable Don. He laughed, he told stories, he strutted through cell blocks as if the trial ahead were just another stage. Reporters outside lapped it up. The Teflon Don, the headlines declared again, marveling at his confidence. But in the quiet halls of MCC, Gravano saw another side. When no cameras were present, Gotti's charm sometimes hardened into cold calculation. He whispered strategies, cursed prosecutors, and at times shifted blame. Gravano's name came up too often in those mutterings. The scapegoat feeling. Word spread that prosecutors were preparing to lean heavily on Gravano's role. He wasn't the boss, but he was the underboss, the executor, the enforcer. In the government story, Gotti was the figurehead, but Gravano was the one with blood on his hands. It was a convenient narrative. Jurors might admire Gotti's style, but they would see Gravano as the blunt instrument of violence. Sammy felt the weight of it. He had always accepted that his role meant dirty work. But to see it twisted into a case where his silence might condemn him, that was something different. Sleepless in MCC. Nights in his cell grew longer. The sound of steel doors clanging shut, the shuffle of guards' boots, the distant cough of another inmate, it all pressed down on him. He thought of his wife, his children, their lives unfolding outside without him. He thought of the construction rackets he had built, the soldiers who had depended on his discipline. He thought of the code he had lived by, omertà, and wondered whether it was leading him not to honor but to ruin. For the first time, Gravano's silence felt less like strength and more like surrender. The quiet divide. To the outside world, Gotti and Gravano were still a pair, the boss and the underboss locked in the same fate. But inside MCC, Gravano began to sense the divide. Gotti lived for the show, confident that his charisma could bend even a courtroom. Gravano, sitting alone in the dark, knew charisma couldn't stop tapes from playing. And worse, he knew those tapes already whispered his name. The foundation of loyalty, once unshakable, now trembled with every sleepless night. Life in MCC. By early 1991, The Metropolitan Correctional Center had become a strange sort of stage for the Gambino hierarchy. John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frank Locascio were housed under the same roof, though their lives inside diverged in telling ways. Gotti strutted the corridors, even in khaki prison clothes as if they were custom-tailored. Guards couldn't help but notice his confidence. Other inmates watched with curiosity, some even awe. To them, the dapper Don had brought his swagger behind bars. Locascio kept to himself, cautious and quiet, the consigliere who knew better than to draw unnecessary eyes. And Gravano, he was there, always there, a presence of silence. He didn't joke with guards. He didn't perform. He sat in the day room with folded arms, his mind elsewhere. To those who watched, he looked calm. Inside, the storm was building, preparing for trial. Lawyers shuttled in and out of visiting rooms. Documents were spread across metal tables. Prosecutors were building their narrative, and everyone knew what the centerpiece would be: the tapes. The rave night recordings weren't speculation. They were voices, captured and replayable. Jurors wouldn't be asked to trust informants or circumstantial evidence. They would be asked to listen. And in those tapes, Gotti's voice dominated. Boastful, commanding, reckless. He named names, issued criticisms, spoke with the kind of bravado that had once made him famous. But Gravano's name floated in those conversations too. Not as the man speaking, but as the man being spoken about. And too often he was painted as the one responsible for the dirtier work. Subtle shifts. Inside MCC, Gravano began to sense subtle shifts. Guards gave him longer stares. Prosecutors lingered on his file during meetings. Even within conversations with Gotti, there were hints, phrases, tones, that suggested where the blame might fall. One evening, after a legal session, Gravano walked back to his cell with the words still ringing in his head. Gotti had joked to a lawyer about Sammy running wild with the construction stuff. It was meant casually, maybe even deflectively. But Gravano heard the undertone. Deflection. Positioning. The first steps in drawing lines of separation. Alone with his thoughts. That night, in his cell, Gravano sat on his cot, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. He thought of his years of loyalty, of the code he had enforced, of the men he had silenced in service of omertà. And now, that same silence was becoming a weapon against him. The boss he had shielded was already maneuvering to make him the lightning rod. Sammy lit a cigarette, the ember glowing in the dark. He inhaled slowly, exhaled, and listened to the faint echoes of the prison around him. For the first time in his life, the thought formed clearly: what if silence no longer served me? Closing the chapter. The arrest had been loud, sirens, flashbulbs, headlines. But the true drama was unfolding in silence. In the cramped cells of MCC, Gravano began to feel the first stirrings of betrayal, not from prosecutors, not from FBI agents, but from the very man he had built his life around. The foundation of omertà had cracked. And though Gravano hadn't spoken a word, the shift had begun. The trial of the century. In January 1991, the Southern District of New York unveiled what the press quickly dubbed the trial of the century. The defendants were John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frank Locascio, leaders of the most powerful crime family in America. The courtroom buzzed each morning with reporters, sketch artists, curious citizens who lined up at dawn just to catch a glimpse. Federal marshals stood guard, their presence reminding everyone that this was no ordinary proceeding. For the government, it was the chance to do what had never been done before: convict the untouchable Teflon Don. For Gravano, it was something different. It was the slow unraveling of loyalty. The prosecution's opening. Prosecutors opened with calm precision. They outlined the Gambino family structure: boss, underboss, consigliere, captains, soldiers. They spoke of decades of corruption, violence, and intimidation. Then they unveiled their weapon, the rave night tapes. These recordings, the lead prosecutor declared, holding up a stack of cassettes, will allow you to hear the defendants in their own words. No hearsay. No speculation. Their voices. Their admissions. Their betrayals. The jury leaned in. Reporters scribbled furiously. Gravano sat still, his jaw tight. Voices in the air. When the first tape played, the room fell silent. John Gotti's voice filled the courtroom, smooth, confident, laced with profanity and bravado. He discussed murders, criticized allies, outlined schemes. It was the Don unmasked, not the smiling man in silk suits, but the boss behind closed doors. And then came the sting. On tape after tape, Gravano's name surfaced. Not his voice, but his name. Gotti spoke of him directly: Sammy's out of control with the construction. Sammy's stirring too much heat. If it goes bad, that's on Sammy. Gravano sat frozen, the words burning into him. It wasn't just evidence. It was betrayal broadcast in open court. The whisper among jurors. The jurors glanced at Gravano when his name echoed from the speakers. Sketch artists' pencils danced across paper, capturing his stoic expression. Reporters whispered to each other, "Gotti's blaming him." Headlines the next day splashed Gravano's name alongside Gotti's, framing him as the violent executor, the underboss who made Gotti's words reality. In the space of hours, years of loyalty were turned into liability. Gravano's inner storm. Inside, Gravano seethed, not with rage but with clarity. He had killed for the family. He had built its fortune. He had enforced omertà. And now the man he had served was pointing at him through the safest of shields, recorded words. He stared at the table before him, hands clasped, face blank. But in his mind, the foundations of silence were cracking louder than the tapes themselves. Omertà had demanded everything of him. And yet here it was, broken not by him but by the boss himself. More tapes, more damage. Each day in court followed a rhythm. Prosecutors wheeled in the cassette deck, the jury adjusted their headphones, and the voices of the Gambino hierarchy filled the air. John Gotti laughed, cursed, ordered. He spoke of rival families, of debts unpaid, of bodies that had disappeared. For the jurors, it was intoxicating, an unfiltered window into a world usually hidden in shadows. And time after time, Gravano's name surfaced. Sammy's got the unions too hot. Sammy pushed too far on that job. If this comes down, we'll hang it on Sammy. Each mention landed like a knife in Gravano's ribs. He didn't flinch outwardly, but inside, his silence screamed. The press reacted. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Headlines the next day carried bold letters. Gotti tapes point to Gravano. Underboss called enforcer of violence. Teflon Don blames right-hand man. Television anchors recited Gotti's lines, voices dripping with drama. Talk radio lit up with callers debating whether Gravano was the true monster behind the scenes. For years, Gravano had lived in shadows, preferring to be unseen. Now the spotlight he never wanted painted him as the villain, while Gotti remained the star. Jurors' eyes. In the jury box, Gravano noticed eyes shifting toward him each time his name rang through the tape recorder. Some jurors frowned. Some scribbled notes. A few stole glances as if trying to reconcile the silent man before them with the violent portrait painted on tape. Gravano sat motionless, hands folded, gaze forward. But in his chest the storm built. Nights without rest. Back at MCC, nights grew unbearable. Gravano lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, the hum of fluorescent lights burrowing into his thoughts. He replayed the tapes in his mind. Gotti's voice. The words, "Hang it on Sammy." Loyalty had been his compass. Omertà had been his creed. But what did loyalty mean when the boss himself had already broken it? He lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and exhaled toward the steel bars. For the first time the thought came clear, sharp, undeniable. Maybe silence is no longer survival. The shift inside. It wasn't betrayal yet. He hadn't spoken, hadn't broken. But something inside Gravano had shifted. He had spent decades enforcing omertà, believing silence was sacred. Now he saw silence for what it could also be, a weapon others used to bury men like him. The courtroom whispers weren't whispers at all. They were shouts, recorded and replayed, echoing across headlines and jurors' minds. And each echo brought Gravano closer to the unthinkable. The avalanche of evidence. As the trial moved deeper into February 1991, the prosecution unleashed its full arsenal. Beyond the rave night tapes, they called witnesses, bookmakers, union men, low-level associates who painted the Gambino family as a machine of intimidation and violence. But the centerpiece remained the recordings. Each time a new tape was played, the courtroom leaned forward, breath held. And each time John Gotti's voice filled the air with arrogance, profanity, and, most damning, blame. Over and over, Gravano's name was tied to acts of blood and business. Not by outsiders, not by prosecutors, but by the boss himself. Gotti's performance continues. Even with the walls closing in, Gotti played his part. He smiled to reporters on courthouse steps. He straightened his tie before walking into the chamber, as if preparing for a magazine cover. He winked at spectators, cracked jokes with marshals. To the public he was still the dapper Don, unshaken, untouchable. Gravano saw it differently. Inside the courtroom, as tapes rolled and evidence mounted, Gotti's charm looked less like strength and more like denial. The boss seemed to believe performance could erase reality. Gravano knew better. Gravano's isolation. For Gravano, each day of testimony was a prison within a prison. He sat silently at the defense table, listening to his own name weaponized. Jurors looked at him differently now. Reporters whispered about him more than Gotti. He was no longer the shadow behind the Don. He was becoming the villain in the jury's eyes, the underboss who made the Don's words into blood. At night in MCC he felt the isolation deepen. Even other inmates treated him cautiously, unsure whether he was the loyal soldier or the man about to be sacrificed. The inner reckoning. On one particularly long night, Gravano lay awake on his cot, staring into darkness. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the tier. In his mind, he replayed the trial, the prosecutor's voice, the jury's glances, Gotti's recorded words. Hang it on Sammy. The phrase looped like a curse. He had lived by silence, bled for silence, killed for silence. And now silence was killing him. For the first time he admitted to himself what had been circling for weeks. Omertà was broken, not by me but by him. By the man I trusted most. And if the code could be broken at the top, why should he, Sammy the Bull, be the one to die for it? Closing the chapter. When court adjourned that Friday, Gravano walked back to his cell with a new clarity. The foundation of loyalty had already collapsed. The only question left was whether he would let it bury him, or whether he would dig his way out, even if it meant doing the unthinkable. The courtroom whispers had become something louder. They had become the first echoes of betrayal, not his betrayal of the family but the family's betrayal of him. And in those echoes, Gravano began to consider a path he had never dared tread, breaking the silence himself. The prison nights. In the Metropolitan Correctional Center, time blurred. Days were measured not by clocks but by the clanging of doors, the count of inmates, the shuffle of guards' boots down concrete corridors. For Sammy Gravano the days were tolerable. He could occupy himself with meetings with lawyers, with brief conversations in the yard, with the mechanics of surviving. But nights were unbearable. When the lights dimmed and the prison settled into its restless quiet, Gravano lay on his cot, eyes open, staring at shadows that seemed to press in from the corners. The silence was no longer his ally. It was his tormentor. Haunted by words. In that silence the words returned. Gotti's voice, captured forever on tape. Hang it on Sammy. It replayed in his mind like a broken record. Over and over, the same phrase, the same betrayal. Gravano clenched his jaw, replaying his years of loyalty, his sacrifices, the men he had buried in service to Omertà. And for what? To become the scapegoat when the spotlight grew too hot? Silence had once been his armor. Now it felt like chains. Family on the outside. He thought of his wife, Deborah, and their children. He imagined their faces as they read headlines branding him the violent underboss, the man prosecutors claimed was the true hand of Gambino violence. He thought of birthdays missed, of holidays spent in prison visitation rooms, of the life slipping away from them while he rotted in a cell for a code that no longer protected him. The idea struck deeper than any FBI interrogation could. His silence was not only destroying him, it was destroying them. The voices of temptation. Federal agents knew the pressure. They didn't push Gravano hard. They didn't need to. They offered small temptations instead, subtle, careful. During an interrogation session, one agent leaned back in his chair and said almost casually, "You know, Sammy, it doesn't have to end like this. Guys in your position? They've made choices. They've lived. Seen their kids grow up. It's all about what you decide." The words weren't direct. They didn't need to be. Gravano didn't answer, but the seed was planted. Alone with the option. Back in his cell, Gravano rolled the idea around in his head like a stone in his palm. Breaking Omertà, was the unthinkable. It was the line no underboss had ever crossed. It was betrayal, exile, death in absentia. But so was silence in a different way. Silence meant life in prison, decades behind steel bars, dying an old man in a cell while his children grew up without him. The code demanded silence. His heart demanded survival. For the first time, Gravano allowed himself to imagine it, the possibility of speaking. Not loudly, not boastfully, but carefully, quietly, like every calculation he had ever made. The first step. He didn't decide that night, or the next, but the seed had rooted. Each sleepless night watered it. Each whisper of Gotti's voice on those tapes nourished it. Each headline painting him as the villain gave it strength. By the end of February, Gravano knew, silence was no longer certain. The code that had defined him for decades was now a question mark. And in the darkness of his cell, that question mark grew larger than anything else. Watching the boss. Inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, Gravano studied Gotti with the same intensity he once used to study construction contracts and rival crews. Gotti was unshaken, or at least he appeared so. He laughed with guards, winked at inmates, walked the tiers as though he were still the king of Mulberry Street. To many it was impressive. To Gravano it was maddening. Every laugh, every smirk felt like denial of the storm they were both trapped in. The evidence was overwhelming, the walls closing in, and yet Gotti clung to his performance. Sammy saw it for what it was, theater. And theater wouldn't save them. A prisoner of silence. Gravano, in contrast, kept quiet. He ate his meals alone, walked the yard in silence, answered only when necessary. Inmates respected him, but they kept their distance. To them he was the bull, calm, dangerous, unpredictable. But inside, Gravano felt less like a bull and more like a prisoner of his own creed. Silence had defined him. Now it suffocated him. The FBI's patience. The FBI understood the art of waiting. They didn't rush Gravano. Instead they chipped away, subtle and careful. Another session in the interrogation room. "You've given your life to a man who's hanging you out to dry," one agent said, his voice low, conversational. "Why should you fall for him? You think he'd do the same for you?" Gravano stared at the table, offering no reply. But the words lodged deep. Later, a different agent added, "Sammy, men like you don't come around often. We don't want you to rot in here. We want you to live." They never demanded. They suggested. They never shouted. They whispered. And in the silence Gravano carried, those whispers grew loud. The breaking of illusions. One night, Gravano replayed it all in his head. The construction rackets he'd built, the soldiers he'd disciplined, the men he'd silenced forever to protect Omertà. He had carried loyalty like a shield, convinced it would protect him. But now that shield was gone. Gotti had pierced it himself, with words on tape, spoken carelessly, selfishly. Gravano turned the thought over again and again. If the boss doesn't live by the code, why should I die for it? A quiet resolution. By March 1991, Gravano had not yet spoken a word to prosecutors. But in his heart, a resolution was forming. He would survive. He would protect his family. He would no longer be a prisoner of a code that others had already betrayed. The long nights of silence had done their work. The bull was ready to move. The final straw on tape. As the trial pressed on, more rave night recordings were read into the record. Each time Gotti's voice rang out, sometimes calm, sometimes seething, always reckless. And then came the line that echoed through Gravano like a gunshot. "If it goes bad, we hang it on Sammy." The words weren't just strategy. They were betrayal in its purest form. Spoken casually by the man Gravano had protected, enforced for, and obeyed without hesitation. Hearing it in open court, with jurors scribbling notes and reporters hungrily typing, Gravano felt something inside him snap. Gotti's cold confidence. That evening back at MCC, Gotti was still joking. He smirked as he passed guards, winked at fellow inmates, carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed he could beat the system again. But Gravano saw something different now. He didn't see confidence. He saw a man willing to sacrifice anyone to keep his throne, even his underboss. The illusion of loyalty was gone. What remained was a stage play, and Gravano realized he was the prop being set on fire for the Don's performance. The family equation. In the solitude of his cell, Gravano weighed the equation the way he had weighed construction bids and street rackets. Carefully, coldly, without emotion clouding the math. Option 1. Keep the code, stay silent. The outcome was certain. Life in prison, decades in a cage, his children growing up without him, his name blackened forever. Option 2. Break the code, speak. The outcome was dangerous. Betrayal, exile, living under constant threat. But it meant survival. It meant freedom, however shadowed. It meant seeing his children again, not through thick glass but across a dinner table. The code demanded sacrifice. His family demanded life. The longest night. That night stretched endlessly. Gravano lay awake, the hum of the lights above him like a taunt. He lit cigarette after cigarette, the smoke curling against the ceiling. Every inhale carried the weight of decades of loyalty. Every exhale carried the bitter truth. Loyalty was already dead. Gotti had killed it with words, not bullets. By dawn, Gravano had reached a place he had never thought possible. Not a decision yet, but an acceptance. The line could be crossed. Omertà was no longer sacred. Closing the chapter. When the morning count echoed through MCC, Gravano rose from his cot with a clarity that felt foreign and frightening. For the first time in his life, silence was not strength. It was weakness. And if he wanted to survive, If he wanted to protect his family, he would have to do the unthinkable. The long nights of silence had carried him to the edge of betrayal. And soon he would step across it. The whisper becomes a thought. In March 1991, after weeks of trial testimony, Sammy Gravano carried a truth inside him he had never dared to entertain. Omertà was not absolute. It had already been broken by John Gotti's words, by the tapes, by the betrayal etched into public record. Now what had once been unthinkable became a possibility. Not a decision yet, but a thought. And thoughts, once born, never go back to silence. The agent's offer. During one of the quieter interrogation sessions, an FBI agent leaned forward, voice soft but steady. "You're a smart man, Sammy. Smarter than most we've dealt with. You've seen how this ends if you don't make a move. Life in a cage. No second chances. You think Gotti will save you? He's saving himself." They didn't push further. They didn't have to. The words echoed the truth Gravano had already admitted in his sleepless nights. The choice was simple on paper: stay loyal and die in prison, or break the code and live, though in shadows, hunted, forever changed. The family factor. What tilted the scales wasn't his own survival. It was his family's. He thought of his daughter, Karen, young and fiery, already carrying the burden of being a mobster's child. He thought of his son, Gerard, still carving out his future. He thought of Deborah, his wife, holding their home together through whispers and headlines. What future did loyalty offer them? A father behind bars, a name blackened, years stolen? If he broke the code, at least he could give them something different. Not normalcy, never that, but life. And to Gravano, that mattered more than honor among men who had already betrayed him. The cold logic of survival. Gravano approached the decision like he had approached rackets. Logically, step by step. Risk of staying silent, guaranteed conviction, life sentence. Risk of talking, betrayal of the code, exile but freedom with protection. Benefit of silence, hollow loyalty to a boss who had already sacrificed him. Benefit of talking, life, family, and a chance to rewrite the ending. It was a calculation only he could make. And in his quiet way, Gravano began to lean towards survival. The mask of loyalty. But outwardly nothing changed. Gravano sat beside Gotti in court, stone-faced, still the picture of loyalty. To soldiers, to reporters, to jurors, he remained the underboss who never wavered. Only inside, in the privacy of his thoughts, did the quiet calculation continue. Watching the boss crumble. By late March 1991, the performance that had carried John Gotti for years began to fray. In court, the tapes played relentlessly, undercutting every smile, every smirk he flashed to jurors. Prosecutors painted him not as a misunderstood neighborhood don but as a reckless boss who had spoken too much, too freely. Gravano watched closely. He noticed the subtle cracks, the way Gotti clenched his jaw when a damaging line was replayed, the way his eyes darted toward the jury box, the faint tightening in his shoulders. It wasn't fear, Gotti never showed fear, but it was calculation. And Gravano realized with cold clarity, every calculation pointed toward sacrificing him. Lacasio's silence. Frank Lacasio, the consigliere, remained the quiet third man at the defense table. He had always been cautious, careful with words. But even he could feel the tide turning. One evening in MCC, Lacasio muttered to Gravano, "They're stacking it all on you." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The words confirmed what Gravano already knew. Gotti's survival strategy was built on his destruction. The lawyers' glances. Even the defense lawyers betrayed subtle signs. They spent more time defending Gotti's image, his charisma, his supposed innocence. When it came to Gravano, they said less, offered fewer explanations. It was as though he were already written off, a piece to be sacrificed in the greater game. Gravano noticed. He noticed everything. The first conversations. When prosecutors extended quiet feelers, Gravano didn't slam the door. He didn't agree, but he didn't refuse. His lawyer, in hushed tones, mentioned possibilities: reduced sentences, relocation, witness protection. A dangerous path, but a path nonetheless. The FBI, for their part, was patient. "You don't have to decide now," one agent told him. "But know this, Gotti's building his case against you. The only question is, do you let him bury you or do you bury him first?" The words weren't threats. They were options. And Gravano, ever the calculator, began to weigh them seriously. The inner decision. Back in his cell, Gravano lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply as the smoke curled upward. He thought of Gotti, smiling for cameras, whispering blame on tapes, laughing even as the ship sank. He thought of his children, faces blurred by time, growing older while he rotted behind bars. And then in the silence he spoke to himself, not loudly but with finality. "I'll talk." It was the first time he admitted it even in private. Not a fantasy, not a temptation, a decision. Closing the section. The quiet calculation had reached its conclusion. Sammy Gravano, once the most loyal enforcer of omertà, had chosen survival over silence. The underboss who had lived in shadows was preparing to step into the light, not for glory but for truth. And in doing so he would bring down the very empire he had helped build. The private meetings. The first formal conversations with the government took place behind closed doors. Gravano was escorted from his cell, through dimly lit hallways, into rooms that smelled of stale coffee and paper. There, federal prosecutors and FBI agents laid it out plainly. "Sammy, we want your testimony. In return we'll protect you. You'll serve time, yes, but not life. You'll see your family again. You'll live." They didn't embellish. They didn't promise freedom without cost. They promised something more valuable: survival. Gravano listened, nodding slowly. He didn't rush. He weighed every word the way he had weighed construction contracts and union disputes. And inside he knew, this was the deal he would take. The moment of choice. Back in his cell, Gravano sat on his cot, elbows on his knees, cigarette burning between his fingers. He thought about the men he had buried in silence, the code he had carried like armor, the loyalty he had enforced with blood. Then he thought of Gotti, his laughter on tape, his casual betrayals, his arrogance in court. The balance was clear. The code was already broken. Silence no longer protected him. Loyalty no longer meant anything. When the guard came the next morning to escort him to another meeting, Gravano stubbed out his cigarette and stood without hesitation. The decision was made. The weight of betrayal. Even after deciding, the weight pressed hard. Gravano knew what this meant. He wasn't just betraying Gotti. He was betraying the life itself. Generations of men had died clinging to omertà, their silence held up as honor. And now he would break it. He would live, but he would never belong again. Not to the Gambino family, not to Bensonhurst, not to the code he had once worshipped. He would step into exile, carrying a new name, a new life, but always shadowed by the memory of what he had broken. The last silence. On his final night before the agreement was sealed, Gravano lay in his cell staring at the ceiling. The hum of the lights above seemed louder than usual, the clanging of bars sharper. He thought of his children, their faces pulling him forward. He thought of Gotti, his words pushing him away. And he thought of silence, the silence that had defined him, protected him, imprisoned him. For the last time he embraced it. He let the silence wash over him, steadying his resolve. And then quietly he let it go, closing the chapter. When morning came, Gravano walked into the meeting room and told the prosecutors what they had been waiting to hear. The underboss of the Gambino family would testify. The quiet calculation was complete. The bull had chosen survival over silence. And with that choice, the fate of John Gotti, and the myth of omertà itself, was sealed. The first session. The room was cold, sterile, a far cry from the smoky backrooms and bustling construction sites where Gravano had once held power. Across from him sat federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and a court stenographer whose fingers hovered over keys, ready to capture every syllable. For a moment, Gravano said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy with history. For decades, silence had been his creed, his armor, his proof of loyalty. Now it would become the very thing he shattered. Finally he spoke. His voice was low, steady, deliberate. "My name is Salvatore Gravano." It was the simplest of statements, yet it marked the crossing of a line no Gambino underboss had ever crossed before. The floodgates open. The agents didn't rush. They asked simple questions first. Dates, names, structures of the family. Gravano answered with precision. He outlined the chain of command: boss, underboss, consigliere, captains, soldiers. He named crews, unions, businesses controlled. He spoke of meetings at rave night, of envelopes passed, of disputes settled. The stenographer typed furiously, each keystroke a nail in the coffin of the Gambino family's silence. Gravano didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He simply told the truth in the same calm tone he had once used to manage construction deals. The agents' reaction. For the agents it was staggering. They had waited years for someone of Gravano's rank to break. Informants had spoken before, but never an underboss, never someone this close to the core. Every sentence Gravano spoke peeled back layers of secrecy that had protected the mafia for generations. "You understand," one prosecutor said cautiously, "this changes everything." Gravano nodded. He knew. The weight of words. Back in his cell, Gravano felt the weight differently. The silence that had once suffocated him was gone, replaced by a strange emptiness. He had spoken. He had crossed the line. There was no going back. He thought of the men who had died for omertà, who had carried their secrets to the grave. He had broken where they had not. But then he thought of his children, of life beyond prison walls, and the emptiness inside steadied. He hadn't broken for nothing. He had broken to live. The ripples. Word spread quickly, even without official confirmation. In whispers through the corridors of MCC, among lawyers and guards, the rumor grew. Sammy the Bull was talking. For some, it was unthinkable. For others, inevitable. But for all, it was the end of an era. Speaking of blood. In the second round of debriefings, prosecutors pressed deeper. Not just names or structures but acts. Gravano understood what they wanted. He began with the murders. His tone didn't waver. He spoke of disputes settled with bullets, of men who disappeared after whispering too loudly, of nights when silence demanded blood. One by one he listed the victims. He described the reasons, the orders, the aftermath. He didn't glorify it, didn't soften it. He delivered each account like a contractor reciting work completed. The agents sat in stunned silence, their pens scratching furiously. The stenographer typed until her fingers ached. Gravano was dismantling the myth of invincibility with his own voice. Racketeering unmasked. From there he moved to racketeering. Construction sites, unions, trucking companies, restaurants. He detailed how contracts were manipulated, how strikes were staged, how money flowed upward through layers of envelopes until it reached the boss. He explained the subtle art of control, how a single whispered threat could halt a project, how a suggested business partner became mandatory, how millions were skimmed without a single gun drawn. The prosecutors nodded, impressed. This wasn't gossip. This was blueprint. Naming the Don. Then came the most explosive part, John Gotti himself. Gravano didn't hesitate. He described how Gotti gave orders, how he reveled in attention, how he spoke too freely at rave night. He confirmed what the tapes had already hinted. Gotti wasn't just a flamboyant figurehead. He was a boss who directed murders, extortions, and betrayals. For prosecutors, it was the missing piece. The tapes had Gotti's words. Gravano gave them context. Together, they formed a narrative that no jury could ignore. The agents saw. When the session ended, one FBI agent leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Sammy," he said, "you just gave us the keys to the kingdom." Gravano said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew the weight of what he had unleashed. The cost of truth. Back in his cell, the silence returned. But this silence was different. It wasn't the suffocating weight of omertà. It was the hollow quiet after an explosion, when the dust still hangs in the air. He had spoken of murders he had committed, crimes he had overseen, loyalties he had enforced. He had painted Gotti, the man he once called boss, as the architect of an empire of fear. Each word had been a knife, cutting through the myth of the Gambino family. Each word had also cut into him. He wasn't Sammy the Bull anymore. He was Sammy the betrayer. Sammy the witness. And he knew the mafia would never forgive him for it. Endless sessions. Day after day, Gravano was escorted into the same sterile rooms. The ritual repeated itself. Prosecutors with yellow legal pads, FBI agents with tape recorders, a stenographer ready to capture history. Each session dug deeper. Names of captains, soldiers, associates. Ledgers of money moved. Murders ordered and carried out. Gravano answered every question, steady, methodical, unflinching. The agents sometimes looked at him in disbelief. Here was a man who had lived at the very core of the mafia machine, calmly dismantling it piece by piece. From underboss to star witness. By April 1991, Gravano was no longer just another defendant. He was the government's star witness. Prosecutors began to reorganize their entire case around his testimony. The tapes gave them sound, Gravano gave them soul. He explained the culture, the codes, the unwritten rules that turned random violence into organized order. Every word from him was dynamite, not just against Gotti, but against the very mythology of the mafia. The silence of the Gambinos. Meanwhile, in the outside world, whispers spread. Somehow, word leaked from the courthouse corridors and prison cells. Sammy the Bull was cooperating. Inside the Gambino family, the reaction was shock, then silence. No threats were shouted, no messages were sent. Just a cold, suffocating silence, as if Gravano had ceased to exist. It was the silence of exile, the unspoken death sentence for anyone who broke omertà. Gravano knew it well. He had enforced it himself. Now it was his to carry. The final break. In one late-night session, after hours of recounting murders, Gravano paused. He leaned back, exhaled smoke and said quietly, "You know what the code means? It means you shut your mouth even if it kills you. Well, I did that for 30 years. And all it got me was a boss who was ready to bury me. So yeah, I'll talk. I'll tell it all." It wasn't just testimony. It was a confession of transformation. The underboss who had lived for omertà had killed it with his own words. Closing the chapter. When Gravano returned to his cell that night, he felt lighter. Not free, not safe, but lighter. The silence that had defined him for decades was gone. He was no longer bound by omertà. He was bound only by survival. And when he stepped into court again, it would not be as John Gotti's underboss, but as the man who would help destroy him. A nation watches. By the spring of 1992, the trial of John Gotti had become more than a legal proceeding, it was a national spectacle. Every morning, television vans lined the courthouse steps. Reporters jostled for quotes. Sketch artists sharpened pencils. The public had seen mob trials before, but never like this. Never with a star defendant as flamboyant as the dapper Don. And never with an underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, ready to testify against his own boss. It wasn't just a trial. It was history being rewritten. The day arrives. On the morning of his testimony, Gravano was led from his secure holding cell to the courthouse under heavy guard. He wore a simple suit, plain and dark, a deliberate contrast to Gotti's tailored elegance. As he entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. Jurors straightened in their seats. Reporters leaned forward. Even Gotti, usually smirking, grew still, his eyes narrowing as he watched the man who had once been his most trusted enforcer take the stand. Taking the oath, Gravano placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. For decades, his oath had been to omertà, sealed in blood and silence. Now, with a raised hand, he pledged loyalty to a different authority, the law. The irony wasn't lost on him. Nor on Gotti. The first questions. The prosecutor began simply. "State your name." "Salvatore Gravano," he replied, his voice steady. "Mr. Gravano, are you currently a member of the Gambino crime family?" "Yes." "What position did you hold in that family?" "I was the underboss." The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The underboss, once second only to John Gotti, now speaking openly under oath. Gotti's gaze. Across the room, Gotti sat stone-faced, eyes locked on Gravano. For once, there was no smirk, no wink, no performance. Just a steady, burning stare. Gravano didn't return it. He kept his eyes on the prosecutor, his answers clipped, precise, methodical. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to dismantle. The jury reacts. Jurors scribbled notes furiously. Some glanced between Gravano and Gotti as if trying to reconcile the picture. The boss and his underboss now turned enemies. The narrative prosecutors had promised was coming alive, not in tapes or speculation, but in the calm, direct words of a man who had lived it. And America was listening. Mapping the family. The prosecutor's questions turned methodical, almost surgical. "Mr. Gravano, can you explain to the jury how the Gambino family is structured?" Gravano leaned into the microphone. His voice was calm, precise. "The boss sits at the top. Beneath him, the underboss. Then the consigliere. Captains run crews of soldiers and associates work under them. Money flows upward. Orders flow downward." He outlined it with the clarity of an architect explaining a blueprint. Every juror listened intently, pens scratching against paper. And under this structure, who was the boss? John Gotti. The words hung in the air. Gravano had named him, not as a neighbor, not as a friend, but as the boss of America's most powerful crime family. The details of power. Gravano then described the mechanics of power, how contracts were controlled, how debts were collected, how intimidation worked without a bullet being fired. He spoke of meetings at the rave night social club, of envelopes passed, of coded conversations that weren't always coded enough. Bit by bit, he stripped away the mystique of the mafia, showing it not as an untouchable empire but as a business of fear, greed, and betrayal. Gotti under the microscope. The prosecutor pressed further. Did Mr. Gotti authorize violence within the family? Yes. Did he order murders? Yes. Gravano answered without hesitation, each word a hammer blow. He recounted specific incidents, tying Gotti directly to decisions jurors could no longer dismiss as speculation. Across the room, Gotti's stare hardened. His jaw clenched, his fists tightened in his lap. For years, his aura had been invincibility. Now, with every sentence, Gravano cracked it open. The media frenzy. Outside, the media devoured every word. Evening news anchors replayed Gravano's testimony with dramatic emphasis. Newspapers ran bold headlines. Underboss names Gotti as boss. Gravano lays bare mafia blueprint. Teflon Don's armor cracks in court. Talk shows buzzed with debate. Was Gravano brave or traitorous? Could anyone trust a killer's word even under oath? Whatever the answer, one fact was undeniable. The mafia's deepest secrets were being aired in prime time. The stare that spoke volumes. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Every time Gravano spoke Gotti's name, jurors glanced at the defense table. Gotti's eyes never left Gravano. It was a stare filled with history, years of loyalty, of shared crimes, of empire building. Now reduced to silence and contempt. Gravano never looked back. He knew what those eyes meant. He knew the unspoken curse behind them. And still he spoke, naming the dead. The prosecutor's voice was steady, but the courtroom leaned in as though bracing for impact. Mr. Gravano, did the Gambino family commit murders under Mr. Gotti's leadership? Yes. Can you tell us who gave the orders? Gravano's eyes fixed forward. His voice didn't waver. John Gotti did. The room fell silent. Then, in chilling detail, Gravano began to recount the killings, names, dates, motives. One juror's hand trembled as she wrote. Another stared at Gravano, lips pressed tight, as if trying to reconcile the calm witness with the violence he described. The calm of a killer. Gravano spoke with the same composure he had used when describing construction rackets. No raised voice. No dramatics. Just facts. It was the very lack of emotion that unsettled listeners most. To him, these weren't stories. They were events, work carried out, debts settled, orders fulfilled. The press later called it, the calm of a killer. America listens. News anchors replayed the testimony with somber tones. The evening broadcast described Gravano's words as, a window into the cold mechanics of organized crime. Editorials debated morality. Some argued Gravano was irredeemable, a murderer now betraying his own. Others saw him as the necessary evil, the only man who could bring down Gotti, the Teflon Don who had evaded justice for too long. For the American public, it was riveting, horrifying, unforgettable. Gotti's silence. At the defense table, Gotti sat immobile. His smirk was gone. His hands clenched white against his knees. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at his lawyers. His eyes stayed locked on Gravano. It wasn't rage exactly. It was deeper than that. Betrayal turned to venom. The stare was so sharp that even jurors noticed. They shifted uncomfortably, sensing the silent war playing out between boss and underboss. The historic moment. By the time Gravano stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom was buzzing with an energy unlike anything seen before. Jurors whispered. Reporters rushed for phones. The underboss of the Gambino family had not only broken omertà, he had shattered the myth of mafia invincibility in open court. And in the silence that followed, the image was burned into memory. Gravano walking past the defense table, Gotti's eyes drilling into him, two men once bound by loyalty now divided by betrayal, forever. The verdict day. On April 2, 1992, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters filled every available seat. Television cameras crowded the courthouse steps. Millions of Americans tuned in, waiting to hear whether John Gotti, the man who had once defied law after law, would finally face justice. Inside, jurors filed in, faces solemn. They had endured weeks of testimony, countless tapes, and the calm yet devastating words of Sammy Gravano. Now their decision would end an era. When the foreman stood, the air seemed to hold its breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, John Gotti, guilty on all counts. The word struck like thunder. The end of invincibility. For years, Gotti had worn the nickname the Teflon Don, charges sliding off him like rain. But this time the coating had cracked. Convicted of racketeering, murder, extortion, and more, Gotti faced life in prison without parole. The once dapper king of Mulberry Street was now just another inmate, stripped of power, stripped of legend. The courtroom eruption. As the verdict echoed, reactions exploded. Reporters scrambled to phones. Some in the audience gasped, others cheered softly. At the defense table, Gotti remained motionless, jaw set, eyes cold. He didn't look at Gravano, didn't look at the jury. He simply stared forward, the mask of defiance unbroken even as the empire crumbled. Gravano, seated quietly under federal protection, didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He simply absorbed the weight of what his words had done. America reacts. That evening, the verdict dominated every headline. Gotti guilty, Teflon Don finally falls. Gravano's testimony seals mafia boss's fate. End of an era in organized crime. Talk shows debated late into the night. Some hailed Gravano as the man who had finally broken the mob's myth of invincibility. Others called him a rat, a murderer who had traded loyalty for freedom. But for the public at large, one truth was undeniable. The mafia had lost its most charismatic symbol. The boss behind bars. Weeks later, Gotti was transferred to federal prison. Gone were the tailored suits and the sidewalk parades. His world shrank to steel bars, khaki uniforms, and the daily grind of an inmate serving life. For the first time in decades, John Gotti was powerless. And he would remain so until his death in 2002. The Gambino fallout. With Gotti convicted and locked away, the Gambino family staggered. Soldiers whispered in backrooms, captains argued over leadership, and the old aura of invincibility shattered overnight. The family still existed, still collected money, still carried influence, but it was fractured. The public spectacle of the trial had stripped away the fear that once cloaked them. Business partners hesitated, unions grew restless, and other families eyed them with a mix of pity and ambition. For the first time in decades, the Gambinos weren't untouchable. They were vulnerable. Gravano in protection. Meanwhile, Gravano disappeared into the folds of the government's witness protection program. New identity, new locations, guarded movements. But no amount of secrecy could erase who he was, or what he had done. He carried not only the weight of his testimony, but also the mark of betrayal. Inside safe houses, Gravano lived quietly. He rose early, kept routines simple, avoided attention. But every shadow felt longer, every face unfamiliar, every silence heavy. He knew the mafia didn't forget. And though they might never find him, he understood he would always live as a man marked. The dual reputation. In America, Gravano became a paradox. To law enforcement and many in the public, he was the man who broke the code of silence and brought down John Gotti, a witness who had achieved what prosecutors for decades had failed to do. But to others, especially in New York neighborhoods steeped in mafia lore, he was something else. A rat. A man who had turned on his boss, his family, his blood oath. Children whispered his name on street corners. Men cursed it in bars. Women shook their heads when it appeared on television. Gravano had survived, yes. But he had not escaped. The mafia's response. The Gambino family did not respond with loud threats or public vows of revenge. Instead, they responded with silence. The kind of silence that Gravano knew better than anyone, cold, lethal, inevitable. He had once enforced it himself, ensuring no traitor survived. Now he lived under its shadow. Every quiet night, every anonymous glance on a street corner carried the same unspoken message. We haven't forgotten. Gravano's reflection. In those quiet hours, Gravano often lit a cigarette and stared at the ceiling of whatever safe house he inhabited. He thought about loyalty, about the years he had given to a code that had crumbled with a few careless words from John Gotti. He didn't regret his choice. Survival had demanded it. But he understood the cost. He was no longer Sammy the Bull, underboss of the Gambinos. He was something else, an exile, a survivor, a man living in the ruins of silence. The Don in a cage. In Marion Federal Penitentiary, John Gotti paced the cell block like a caged lion. Gone were the silk ties, the expensive cologne, the sidewalk parades. In their place were khaki prison clothes, scheduled meals, and steel bars that would never open to freedom. Even behind bars, Gotti carried himself with swagger. Inmates looked at him with awe. Guards sometimes muttered about his charisma. But none of it mattered. His empire was gone. His influence was fading. The Teflon Don had become just another inmate serving life without parole. The bull in the shadows. Meanwhile, Sammy Gravano lived in quiet exile. He had air, he had sky, he had the freedom to walk streets Gotti never would again, but he also had shadows that never left. Every knock on the door made him tense. Every unfamiliar car parked on the street stirred suspicion. He lived, yes, but always with the knowledge that the silence he had broken was hunting him still. Freedom was real, but peace was not. America's judgment. For the American public, the saga became a parable. Gotti's fall marked the end of an era when mafia bosses could strut openly, untouchable and adored. Gravano's betrayal shattered the romantic myth of loyalty that had long surrounded organized crime. To some, Gravano was a necessary evil, the insider who made justice possible. To others, he was irredeemable, a murderer who had traded blood for a lighter sentence. Either way, their intertwined names became part of American history. Gotti, the Don who flew too close to the sun. Gravano, the bull who broke the silence. The cost of choice. Late at night, in the quiet of his safe house, Gravano often asked himself the same question. Had he done the right thing? Survival said yes. The code he had once bled for said no. What he understood, finally, was that there was no clean answer. He had chosen life, but life had come at the cost of everything else. His honor, his identity, his place in the world he once ruled. Closing the story. The fall of John Gotti and the betrayal of Sammy Gravano was not just the collapse of two men. It was the collapse of a myth, the myth of invincibility, the myth of loyalty, the myth that silence was unbreakable. In the end, the Don sat in a cage, the bull lived in shadows, and America learned that even the strongest empires could crumble, not from the outside but from within. And so, the story closed not with gunfire, not with glory, but with silence broken, and silence lost forever.